Welcome back to the Cyber Resilience Brief, a Safe Breach podcast. Today, we're continuing on in our deep dive into Russian nation-state threat actors. We've profiled the chaotic Western teenagers of Scattered Spider, codenamed the Teens. Now we're turning our eyes east to the spies. But Adrian, my understanding is that the spies is not just one group.
No, Tova, it's not. And understanding the distinction is crucial for attribution and defence. Our work constantly makes it clear to us that there is no single agency with sole responsibility. In fact, there is documented competition between various agencies for resources and influence.
So let's break down the big three that we've discovered. That's the GRU, the SVR, and the FSB. And I understand the SVR is also called SVR. Who are the GRU?
So the main directorate of the General Staff, or GRU, is Soviet military intelligence, Russian military intelligence. Think of them as the sledgehammer. They're characterised by a willingness to conduct brazen and aggressive operations, often with questionable operational security.
So I think sledgehammer and what you just described is a bit of a lead in here, but can you describe more in depth what kind of attacks they do?
Yeah, so if you're used to associating the hammer and sickle with Russia, they're the sledgehammer and sickle. They're especially destructive. They engage in military intelligence, election interference, coordinated leaks, all the way through to assassination. The Sergei Skripal attacks with Novichok in the UK were the GRU. Also, in the cyber realm, if you remember, nearly 10 years ago now, but NotPetya, the massive wiper malware, that was the GRU. Groups like APT-28, Fancy Bear, APT-44, Sandworm fall under this umbrella. Their goal is strategic disruption and destruction.
By the way, I think it might be worth it for us to go over NotPetya in a future episode. I have to say that I was not into cybersecurity 10 years ago, so I'm sure that not just me, but our listeners would love a refresh, but more on that after the jump. Okay, let me get this straight then. The GRU, that's the military. What about SVR?
So SVR is the foreign intelligence service. Think of them as a scalpel, very precise, used with precision. They're the civilian foreign intelligence agency. They focus on high levels of technical expertise, stealth, and long-term collection. Every time you hear about long-term sleeper agents in the USA, in the UK, anywhere outside of Russia, integrated into the local community, whose own children do not know that their parents are Russian, do not know their allegiances and purpose, that's these folks, the SVR.
The SVR wants to move fast, but they don't want to break things.
Well, not always necessarily fast. They will undertake operations that take 20, 30, 40 years. But what they do want to know as a defining characteristic, Tova, is exactly that, knowledge. They want to know things. Bear operations like APT-29 Cozy Bear are designed to gain and retain persistent, undetected access. Once they get in, they will dwell for years. Why? Because they're deep dive spies. They prioritise remaining undetected, which contrasts sharply with the loud and chaotic attacks of Scattered Spider.
And we'll be right back.
And that leaves us with the third player, the FSB. We've identified them as the critical agency in this context, which sounds like we've already addressed two critical agencies. Why the FSB? What makes them different?
So the FSB is the Federal Security Service. It handles domestic security and counterintelligence. It's what used to be the KGB. But here's the key. They're the agency with the most publicly documented propensity for cultivating relationships with and utilising criminal and civilian hackers.
So it's the FSB that's the face of the Russian nation-state actors when they work with the cyber underground.
Yeah, think of them as a reverse initial access broker. They recruit useful fools on behalf of the whole Russian apparatus. We know there are DOJ indictments describing close connections where criminal hackers are used to augment and staff FSB cyber units. This willingness to engage with the criminal underground makes them the only plausible Russian entity capable of monitoring or co-opting access from the Scattered Spider Alfie network.
Okay, so this is a difference in operational philosophy.
Exactly. SVR is too professional for these messy criminal groups. SVR wants to remain in the shadows and be undetected. Their goal is not to be seen. GRU is too focused on destruction. They're the sledgehammer. They just want to cause destruction, cause chaos. But the FSB, they see opportunity and they are much less risk-averse than the other agencies.
Interesting. Okay. And throughout our research, we've also discovered some TTP, tactics, techniques, and procedures alignment regarding social engineering. Tell me a little about that.
So this is a fascinating technical point, Tova. Traditional Russian APTs often rely on high-volume phishing. But FSB-linked actors like the group Cold River employ highly involved social engineering and persona development, a stock-in-trade skill for intelligence agencies. It's often what's always referred to as a legend. It's building a credible false identity that will withstand investigation.
Interesting. And how does that compare to Scattered Spider?
It aligns strategically. Scattered Spider does high-volume SIM swapping and impersonation. The FSB does targeted persona development, which is highly skilled, to trick targets into bypassing two-factor authentication.
So if the FSB gets access to Scattered Spider's techniques, then what happens?
Our intelligence indicates that the fundamental difference is high volume versus targeted. But if the FSB gains access to Scattered Spider's high-yield methods via RAS monitoring, they could rapidly integrate these effective low technical overhead tactics into their own espionage operations.
They can learn from the youngsters, these useful fools.
They can and do learn, and they steal the keys the teens have already stolen.
And we'll be right back.
Okay, so let's also chat briefly about, we've touched upon plausible deniability. Whilst the FSB are much less risk averse, they'd still far rather that somebody else is going to prison and carrying the can and getting the blame, and not them. They're very, very skilled in tradecraft. They're very, very skilled in manipulation. The useful fools are themselves being social engineered and manipulated. Trained intelligence officers are very, very good at figuring out motivation, whether it's political, financial, reputational. As we mentioned before, some of these groups are just looking for fame and publicity. They somewhat naively think that getting publicity is going to make them attractive as a hacker in industry. Long story too short, no, it doesn't. My friends in intelligence agencies, they want the hackers that have never been caught, guys and girls. They do not want people who've been put in prison. The very best people, not that I'm encouraging anybody to be hacking in a criminal sense, but the best people leave no trace and do not get caught. And that's who will end up working for government agencies. The people on the outside being used and abused are disposable. You have anybody whispering in your ear telling you that you're providing this valuable service for them, that you're very important, they will burn you in a heartbeat. And that's what they do.
And the groups do it to each other, by the way. I remember this from our episode on the comm. We think they're working together, but in some ways they're working in competition with one another. Am I right about that?
You are right. There is no loyalty. Honour amongst thieves is the principle. There is no loyalty. And also intelligence agencies have got huge budgets. They can, if they perceive loyalty that they want to destroy and disrupt, they will. They can give advantage to one member and not another. They can give more money to one member. They can give more publicity. They're very, very good at sowing discontent and discord. They're skilled at doing this. They know how to do this. They know how to do this very well. They understand cognitive biases. They understand psychology. Remember that their key underlying purpose is discontent, discord, and disruption and destruction. They're not about being creative and building things. They're about causing chaos agents, and anybody and everybody can be useful to them.
Well, that brings us up to time for this episode. Adrian, thank you again for giving us all of this context on the background behind these three groups that we usually loop together as Russian threat actors, even though they are from the same source, potentially, but not actually working together. In the next episode, we're going to discuss the high confidence indirect nexus. That's the bridge between civilian criminals and the FSB. We're talking about Black Cat. In the meantime, folks, stay safe. Stay safe with Safe Breach.
Thank you, Tova.
The Cyber Resilience Brief is a Safe Breach podcast. Executive produced by Adrian Cully and Tova Dvorin. Music produced by Sar Dressner. Hosted, edited, and compiled on Riverside. For more about Safe Breach and how you can validate your security controls across your entire IT infrastructure, visit us at www.safebreach.com. That's www.safebearch.com.